Haunted Possessions. The Sinister Scarecrow. Chilling tales and scary stories. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. It happened again. Yet another dead body was found in the cornfields. Seemingly without fail, at least one dead body turns up on the land of the old farm every autumn. Junction Ridge used to have a lot of farms, but now only a few remain. One particular farm stands out. No matter what the name of the current owner may be, everyone simply calls it the Old Graslow Farm. A lot of local folks believe that the old Graslow farmhouse, along with its land, are cursed. While calling a place cursed may seem superstitious and outdated in the 21st century, the facts do tell a strange story. For instance, the Junction Herald Tribune recently reported a grotesque discovery on the old Graslow farm. The current owner of the farm, Mr. Eric Kirby, was out working in the cornfield when he saw it. The bloody, lifeless corpse of a young man laid in his cornfield. The body had been badly mauled. Lacerations covered the cold, pale flesh. Red blood spatter covered the yellow cornstalks. The scene was horrific. The Junction Ridge Police Department, with the help of forensics, determined that a scythe had been used to kill the young victim. A police officer recovered the weapon. The blood-stained scythe had been found in the hands of a scarecrow that stood overlooking the cornfield. The scarecrow was dressed in a black robe with a black conical crowned hat on the top of its pumpkin head. The pumpkin had been carved with sharp but wide eyes and a fiercely menacing mouth. This creepy scarecrow was attached to a pole. It stood an intimidating 13 feet above the ground. The police took Mr. Eric Kirby down to the police station for questioning. He was, of course, the first and obvious suspect. Both the victim and the murder weapon had been found in his field. In addition to those potentially incriminating facts, an incident had occurred in those fields the night of the murder. 5 kids, ranging from 17 to 19 years old, had partied in the old Graslow fields the night of the killing. The murder victim, Eddie, was part of the partying group. The kids had gone to the cornfield to drink some alcohol and smoke some herb. In a small town in the Hudson Valley, there isn't much to do, and there are few places to do the things that kids want to do. So, partying in a place like a quiet and isolated cornfield can become pretty routine. 3 guys and 2 girls, named Katie and Amy, had been having a good country time when they began to hear some noises. They had heard the sound of someone or some animal moving through the corn. They weren't alone. Inebriated as they had been, their reaction time wasn't exactly the greatest. One of the girls, Katie, thought that she had seen a dark silhouette with a pumpkin for a head moving in the corn. Frightened as she was, she dismissed what she had seen and chalked it up to what they had smoked. "Hey! You no good little SOBs! This is private property! Get out of my field! This corn isn't harvestable, and it's because you keep coming out here doing God knows what, and you damage my crops!" Mr. Kirby yelled as he ran towards them. Eddie replied, "Hey, old man, want to join us? We know that you're an alcoholic, and that you like to hit your stepdaughter. Why don't you come and try that crap with me, huh?" Mr. Kirby, who had been drinking, ran towards them with a scythe in his hands and screamed, "I'm going to kill you! You're dead!" Eddie and his 4 friends ran out of that field as fast as they could as they yelled, "You're crazy, you sick drunk!" Having questioned the 4 surviving friends, the police had more than an abundance of evidence to arrest Eric Kirby on suspicion of murder. They also learned that Eric Kirby was an alcoholic with a nasty temper. He had violently raised his hand to his stepdaughter, Amy, on a number of occasions. Eric Kirby had motive and opportunity to kill Eddie. This case seemed to be clear-cut. Amy cried in her room. Eddie had been one of the few people that had treated her well. Ever since Amy, her mom, and her stepdad moved to Junction Ridge that summer, she had a hard time fitting in. Being a 16-year-old girl was difficult enough, but being a 16-year-old girl that moved to a small town makes everything harder. At school, the cool kids bullied and made fun of her. The popular girls laughed at her and mocked her because her parents were farmers, and because she dressed in goth clothing. They called her a spooky freak and a ghoulish goth chick because she was a horror fan. One of the hidden but real reasons that the popular kids emotionally bullied her was because they were intimidated by her. She was smart and beautiful. Therefore, they saw her as a threat to the hierarchy of their social status. Amy knew that things would go from bad to worse at school now. Not only was her friend murdered, but her wretched stepfather had been arrested for the murder. She foresaw that the cool kids would now call her the spooky kid of a drunk and deranged killer. As much as the prospect of even worse bullying troubled her, it was the tragic loss of Eddie that filled her with a seemingly bottomless sorrow. If the physical abuse by her wicked stepfather, the murder of Eddie, and being bullied for being different wasn't enough, then the strange things she had experienced on the farm certainly were. On a number of occasions, Amy had seen strange things. Sometimes she directly saw strange things, and other times she saw shadowy things from the corner of her eye. At the center of all her unsettling experiences was the Scarecrow. The creepy Scarecrow unnerved her to the marrow of her bones. In July, shortly after they moved to the farm, Amy noticed that the Scarecrow would inexplicably be in different positions. One time, as she headed to the barn, she saw that the Scarecrow had its right hand raised as its pumpkin head faced straight ahead toward the house. Then, as she returned from the barn, which was on the left side of the house, she noticed that the pumpkin head had turned towards the barn. It had been looking directly at her. Even though it was a sweltering hot and humid summer day, an ice-cold chill traveled down her spine. She felt an unnatural presence. Then there was the time that she had been working in the flower garden, and she heard someone running in the field. Startled, she swirled her head to the sound of someone running through the field. As she turned her head, she froze, not on account of what she saw, but on what she didn't see. The Scarecrow was not in its normal place on the pole in the front of the house. It was nowhere to be seen. One night, Amy was doing dishes at the kitchen sink. She had been in a good mood that day, because she had gotten back from her friend Katie's house. They had watched The Lost Boys. It was one of their favorite vampire movies. Watching her favorite horror movies always comforted Amy. They were an escape from the troubles of the real world. Horror films were a place where the outcast often beat the big bad monster. In these films, people like herself weren't the losers. No, they were the survivors. More than that, they were the heroes. The other reason that horror movies felt like home to her was because she used to watch them together with her biological father. Those were the wonderful days in the time before he died of cancer. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. While washing the dishes in the kitchen sink, Amy's heart felt warm and filled with love. That's when she saw two yellowish red eyes staring at her through the window. In the darkness beyond the glass window stood the dreadful Scarecrow. Its pumpkin head looked right at her. It was only 3 feet away from the window. Amy dropped the glass cup that she had been washing, and the glass shattered. Her sense of love and peace had shattered along with the broken glass. A fearful dread washed over her. The noise of the accident brought her stepfather into the kitchen, and he slapped her right across her face. Her nose bled. The Scarecrow watched it all. Amy thought that she must have been going mad. Her late grandmother on her mother's side had suffered from schizophrenia. Amy had feared that she too might one day slip into the land of mental illness. What she was seeing with the Scarecrow made her think that the gene that can cause mental illness might have been triggered in her. She had read that schizophrenia often comes on between the teenage years and your early 30s. She was 16, so maybe it was beginning. Going to see a psychiatrist might have been Amy's next step had she not spoken to Katie after the murder of Eddie. With tears in her eyes, Katie lit a cigarette and began to talk. Amy, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I have to tell you something. Please don't laugh, okay? Said Katie as she put the cigarette to her lips and inhaled deeply. Katie, I promise I won't laugh. You can tell me anything at all. I'm here for you. You're about the only friend that I have left here, gently replied Amy. Okay, I saw something the night that Eddie was murdered. It's an impossible image that I haven't been able to get out of my head. I just feel something deep inside of me, and it's telling me to tell you what I saw. Before your psycho stepfather came out and chased us with a fracking weapon, I saw something with a pumpkin for a head moving through the field, explained Katie as the cigarette shook in her trembling hand. With her eyes wide, Amy took out a pack of cigarettes from her purse and quickly took out a cigarette from the pack. With her hands now trembling, she lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. As she exhaled, she began to tell Katie all about her experiences with the creepy Scarecrow and how she sincerely believed she was going mad. Amy added that she too had seen the menacing Scarecrow that night. The two friends, although terribly frightened, felt comfort in confessing to each other what they had experienced. Something unexplainable was afoot, but at least they weren't dealing with this alone. They had each other. At times like that, having someone to lean on means everything. Evil wants to isolate you. Like a predator, it cunningly works to separate its prey from the herd. In the case of humans, our family and friends are our herd. Like a lion or wolf, once the prey has been separated, the vicious attack commences. In order to make sure that a deranged person hadn't been impersonating a scarecrow, Amy and Katie inspected the sinister scarecrow. They confirmed what their intuition had suggested. The scarecrow was no man. It was made of straw, and its head was a carved pumpkin. There was no way for someone to put that pumpkin on their head as a mask. The bottom of the pumpkin was intact. There was no place to slide your head into the bottom. The girls agreed that this had been the exact pumpkin head that they had seen attached to this scarecrow as it stalked around the fields. While both Amy and Katie had an extensive knowledge of horror movies and folklore about monsters, they weren't aware of any significant lore about paranormal scarecrows. They decided that a visit to the town historian was to be their next step. Old man Mr. Fox was the town historian of Junction Ridge. He was well acquainted with the folklore of the Hudson Valley. The two girls drove to Mr. Fox's house. A cold September rain began to fall. Cold and wet, they knocked on the door. The kindly Mr. Ted Fox opened the door. The girls explained that they were interested in learning more about the history of Amy's property. Mr. Fox answered, "Come on in, ladies. It's miserable out there. Come inside before you catch a cold." Amy responded, "Thanks so much, Mr. Fox." As the girls took off their raincoats and hung them by the door, Mr. Fox said, "I'm so sorry for the loss of your dear friend Eddie. What a terrible tragedy. You're going through a lot. If there's anything I can do to help, you girls just let me know." "Thanks, Mr. Fox. As a matter of fact, there is something that we were hoping that you could help us with. Amy answered as she and Katy sat down on the couch in the living room. Ah, yes. Yes. You would like to know more about the history of your house, said Mr. Fox softly. Yes, please. That would be very much appreciated, said Amy as she pushed her silky black hair away from her eyes. Mr. Fox folded his arms across his chest as he began to tell them the history of Amy's farmhouse. Well, the old Graslow farmhouse was built in 1813. For its first 125 years of existence, many farms sprawled across the lands of the Hudson Valley. Junction Ridge was primarily a farmer's town until demographics really changed in the 1960s. Farmers live and die by the weather. Some years are better than others. Droughts and bad weather are part of the reality of farming, but one year was particularly bad. In 1866, a severe drought and a scorching sun decimated crops all across the Hudson Valley of New York. Katy sighed as she had grown a bit impatient and said, Excuse me, Mr. Fox. I appreciate the history lesson, but how relevant is a drought from over a century? How relevant is the weather to a supposed curse? That's what you want to know, isn't it? Mr. Fox interjected before Katy could finish her sentence. Yes, actually, replied Katy as her big brown eyes grew wide. Don't be surprised. Given the recent murder at the old Graslow farm, it doesn't take the deduction of Columbo to guess why you're here, said Mr. Fox as he straightened his glasses near his nose. Oh, right. I suppose it was pretty obvious. Please continue, said Katy as she smiled slightly. Old man Mr. Fox continued. So the drought was really, really bad in 1863. Some farmers lost everything and sold their farms for what they could. Almost all of the farmers did the best that they could, but chalked up the hardships as an act of God that was out of their control. Now, I said almost all of the farmers reacted with these sentiments, but not all of the farmers surrendered to this fate. Reginald Graslow refused to accept that events were out of his control. He wasn't going to let his livelihood and his property slip away from him. So, it's said that he took matters into his own hands. It's important to note that the practice of Spiritism and the occult skyrocketed during and after the Civil War. The inconceivable number of deaths impacted the psyche of the American people, and many of them opened what Christian society would have called forbidden doors. What forbidden doors did they open? What exactly did Reginald Graslow do? Amy asked as she sat up straight as a level. In a somber and serious tone, Mr. Fox replied, Stories that have been passed down through the generations speak of the unspeakable. It is said that Reginald Graslow was skilled in dark magical arts. He was a practitioner of the old ways. On October 31st of 1863, Reginald performed a dark ceremony. He offered his 13-year-old son Wesley as a sacrifice to Demeter. To the ancient Greeks, Demeter was the goddess of agriculture. The innocent virgin blood of his own son had been spilled. Ever since that horrific night, records of strange deaths on the old Graslow farm have persisted through the years. There are a number of reports of a sinister scarecrow that stalks the fields. Just as sure as the arrival of the fall season, every autumn sees at least one person die on the old Graslow land. The lore says that the human sacrifice opened a door to a dark presence. The opening of this forbidden door acted as an invitation for a malevolent spirit to possess the Graslow property. Some believe that the possession is more specific. If there is truth to this, I happen to be of the opinion that it is not the land itself that's cursed. No, it's the infernal scarecrow that's cursed. It's diabolically possessed. The pretty faces of the two young women grew pale as Mr. Fox concluded his tale. Amy responded, "Wow, we have both seen the sinister scarecrow move and skulk around. I wasn't going to mention it to you because I know how crazy it sounds. In fact, until today I thought that I was losing my mind. So, let's say this was real. Is there a way to end the curse? Is there a way to kill the sinister scarecrow and close the forbidden door?" Rubbing his white bearded chin, Mr. Fox thoughtfully said, "Those are great questions, young lady. Hypothetically, one could perform a cleansing ritual and exorcise the malevolent entity from the scarecrow. Then one would burn it, banish it, and send it back to its dark realm while closing the opened portal. This would help the person to reclaim and take ownership of everything on their rightful property." "Do you happen to have the spells or literature that gives detailed instructions to perform such a cleansing ritual?" asked Amy as her hazel eyes narrowed. "Why, yes, dear. I do have the manuscripts. However, it's too dangerous. I can't let you attempt this by yourself. Evil doesn't want to be forced out. It wants to keep acting upon whatever it's been given rights to. Malevolent inhuman spirits or demons will not quietly allow you to try to reclaim your rights over an object or a place. The history shows that this particular spirit is not only capable of killing, but that it does so again and again each year. It won't hesitate in attempting to kill you or anyone else that gets in its wicked way," Mr. Fox answered with a concerned look. "Okay, I understand that, and I appreciate your concern, Mr. Fox. I really do. But the thing is, I live in the old Graslow farmhouse. The evil scarecrow has been watching and stalking me. It already killed Eddie. Eddie was a sweet kid. He was my friend. If we don't do something, the killings will continue. If there is something that we can do, and we refuse to do it because we're afraid, then any future blood that's spilled by the scarecrow will be on our hands," Amy responded in a determined voice. "Yes, child, you are right. At 73, I'm not a young man anymore, but I will help you. I'll come with you, and I'll help you to perform the cleansing ceremony. We will burn that rotten scarecrow. We will put an end to this vile spiritual plague," said Mr. Fox with more conviction. So it was that Mr. Fox, Katy, Amy, and their friends Brian and Sam prepared for battle. Brian and Sam were with the girls partying in the field the fateful night that Eddie had been murdered. Eddie had returned to the Graslow farm that night to play a prank on Amy's stepfather. He had wanted to get some payback for the insane threats made by Amy's stepfather. Unfortunately, that decision cost Eddie his life, because when he returned to the field, he was shredded to pieces by the evil killer scarecrow. Late at night on All Hallows' Eve, the team went to Amy's house to put an end to the evil. They sought justice and closure. The old manuscript called for the ceremony to begin at the witching hour. It was to be completed as night became dawn on All Saints' Day, November 1st. It was a brisk, chilly autumn night. Rain from earlier in the evening had caused fog to develop and be trapped in the Hudson Valley. The light of the moon gave the fog an eerie glow. Nature seemed to have set the spooky atmosphere to match the ominous feeling felt by all. Things did not start according to plan. As the team arrived to the post where the cursed scarecrow usually stood, they saw that it wasn't there. Their hearts began to beat more rapidly. The release of adrenaline heightened their senses. They were so alert that even the sighting of a cat prowling the night startled them. They were on edge, and with good reason. Mr. Fox began setting up an altar on a tree stump. As he did so, Amy, Katy, and Sam sprinkled holy water around the property. Brian investigated a sound that he had heard in the field. He was carrying a machete. the light of his flashlight did not provide much help because a denser fog seemed to be rolling in. The sound of the corn being slapped as though something was moving through it caused Brian's stomach to relocate to his chest. Fear settled in. Ready to strike, he raised his machete. Suddenly, the demonic scarecrow appeared in front of him. Its yellowish red eyes glowed through its pumpkin head. Brian hacked the monstrosity's right arm off. The severed arm made of straw fell to the ground. After a brief moment, the severed arm launched from the ground and flew to Brian's neck. In disbelief, Brian gasped for air, but it was no use. The cursed arm made of straw choked the life out of him. With eyes burning, the scarecrow looked on from only several feet away. Lifeless, Brian's body dropped to the ground. Amy, Katie, and Sam were concerned that they didn't know where Brian was. They began to search for him when Mr. Fox told them, "No, do not go looking for him. The sinister scarecrow wants to isolate us. Entering into that field in this fog will make that an easy task for him. We must remain here. We must stay together. We won't be able to kill this vile thing with ordinary weapons. We need to do the ritual. We need to follow the plan. Only when we get started and bless our weapons will they offer us any meaningful protection. Now, Amy, this is your home, and you have to be the celebrant of these sacred cleansing rites." Amy approached the altar. Enshrouded by the gloomy but slightly illuminated fog, she began to read the words of the ritual. As she did so, an unnatural and loud shriek was heard in the cornfield. The shriek was followed by the sound of something violently running through the field. The start of the ritual had not gone unnoticed. The scarecrow grew furious. A glowing light began to encircle Amy, Katie, Sam, and Mr. Fox. Moments later, the wicked scarecrow came running out of the cornfield and towards the group. The scarecrow had picked up the machete that Brian had dropped as his dead body had fallen to the cold ground. The insidious monster raised the machete in its right hand. The very arm that Brian had severed had reattached itself to the hideous figure. The unholy straw man charged toward them, but it was propelled backwards. The glowing light surrounding this brave team had formed a protective barrier around them. The scarecrow furiously thrust the blade against the magical force field. Again and again the scarecrow slashed and hacked at the luminous perimeter, and again his attempts were thwarted. The ritual required hours of time, and the scarecrow incessantly tried to break through the ring of protection the entire time. It shrieked a blood-curdling shriek again and again. It raged to and fro again and again. It tried to intimidate them. It tried to gain power over them by instilling and filling them with fear. These attempts proved to be futile. The brave team stayed united together. Amy refused to break her concentration. She would not, could not look beyond the necessary task at hand. Minutes before the break of dawn, Amy recited the words, "I reject and denounce evil. The past evil committed by others will not bind me. I am free. Evil is not welcome here. I bind the evil that was summoned here, so that it will do no further harm. The evil is bound, and it shall burn as the sun rises this morning. The light has revealed the evil. No longer can it hide in darkness. I take authority of my land. Light scatters the darkness. Let the light of the sun shine and destroy this unwelcome, vile spirit." The recitation of those words changed everything. Suddenly the scarecrow, apparently compelled by an unseen force, flew up off of the ground and onto its pole. As it was invisibly bound to the pole, it shrieked. Only this time, the shriek sounded to be caused by pain rather than a pure anger. Then, as the sun rose, the sinister scarecrow burst into flames. The scarecrow was never seen again. Amy's stepfather went to prison for the murder of Eddie. The evidence was overwhelming, and arguing that a cursed scarecrow was the killer was not something that would hold up in court. Although Amy's stepfather was innocent in this case, he had in fact killed an ex-girlfriend of his years ago. No one had been able to prove it, but he was guilty. Seems like karma got to him. A lifetime sentence in prison ensured that he would never beat Amy again. With the help of Old Man Mr. Fox and her friends, Amy reclaimed her life. No longer does she walk in fear and darkness. The light shines her path. I hope that you enjoyed your stay here at the haunted Half Moon Inn. The Master requests that you consider supporting me and the inn by becoming a patron of mine on Patreon. The Half Moon Inn needs your support to keep the doors open. You wouldn't want the residents here to feel forgotten and abandoned, would you? Creating quality scary stories to share with you is very important to me. Running this inn of horror is a passion of mine, and I would truly appreciate your support. The world is hurting. It needs more horror. Help me to heal the world through horror. Together, with your help, we could haunt this world one home at a time. Until next time, always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there.